is real. Listen.
What does the government know about who has what types of paranormal experiences? You didn't think they cared, but they do. And what sorts of things fall under the very broad umbrella of the paranormal? How did Traci and Kathy meet, and what led them to start this podcast? What was the original name of the Paranormal Museum in amazing Asbury Park, New Jersey? Well, in this episode, you'll find the answers to all of these things and more. It's a special episode because it's an interview I did with none other than my co-host, the Kathy A. Kelly, on my other podcast, which is Unpacking Possibility with Dr. Traci Stein. Now, I know you're probably more of a fan of the paranormal, but on that podcast, I explore everything from ways people tap into their intuition, learn to feel better, do better, and live better overall, and so much more. But again, in this episode, it's really very paranormally themed, and I had such a great time chatting with my good friend Kathy. If this is interesting to you, if you are curious, stay tuned. So, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Unpacking Possibility. I'm your host, Traci Stein. As always, I am so happy to be here with you. So tonight's episode is especially exciting for me because I am bringing back my good friend and co-host of my other podcast, Kathy Kelly. So some of you may already remember a Halloween episode Kathy did with me on this podcast a few years ago. It was great. I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't already. But tonight, Kathy and I are going to chat a little so you can get to know her a little bit better. And we want to talk about a topic that's near and dear to us. And it might be nearer to you than you previously will have thought prior to tonight. So anyway, without further ado, welcome Kathy Kelly, otherwise known as the Kathy Kelly.
Hi, Traci. How are you?
All right. How are you? I'm going to give
Good.
a super brief blurb, but we could never encapsulate all of who you are in one blurb. But Kathy Kelly, otherwise known as the Kathy A. Kelly, is a historian. She's an entrepreneur. She is also the proprietress and founder of the Paranormal Museum and Bookstore in amazing Asbury Park, New Jersey. Also, founder of the original Asbury Park Ghost Tour. So as I mentioned, Kathy is my co-host for our other podcast, and she has another one in addition to that herself. But I was going to say new podcast, but it's almost a year old. It'll be a year old May 4th, which is crazy. That podcast is called Curious Explorers. And in that podcast, we explore everything from history and mysteries to the paranormal. We have just under 76,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you like videos, please check us out and give us a follow there. But tonight, Kathy and I'm hoping we'll talk about why we started that podcast and why it might be a fit for you as well. Because whatever you think paranormal experiences or beliefs are, they are much more common than most people would think. So we'll talk about what that means, some common examples, why we started the podcast and more. So I'm going to come back over to the virtual room. Kathy, thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So good to see you. It's so interesting to see you in a different virtual setting, even though it's the same one.
But it's slightly different.
I notice you have a new background with, it looks like the Loch Ness Monster, Nessie.
Actually, no, this is actually, this is one of those weird cases, and one of the few cases where a cryptid has actually been accused of violence. And this is a drawing by a young man who was involved in something that led to the deaths of 4 of his friends. And he claimed that this creature actually came up out of the sea and took them. And
That sounds awful.
Yeah, no, awful. I mean, and they're gone. Their bodies were never found or anything like that, but it's one of the few cases um where a legal proceeding actually had a cryptid involved in it.
So this is an odd way for us to start this
Yes.
podcast. A, because
Segue.
most of the listeners of this podcast, unlike the other one, it's mostly audio. Um, this is a little bit of a darker vibe to start the podcast.
Right.
But, cryptids are something that we've talked about. Do you wanna just give the quick definition of cryptid for those who are not familiar with the term?
So a cryptid is an animal or a creature that people are experiencing, seeing, coming into contact with that there isn't a fossil record for, and there is no that has not been substantiated by the scientific uh, community. Bigfoot would be an example
Yeah,
of a cryptid, but I would argue so would say like giant panda, which was a cryptid until it was until they found one and determined that it wasn't a mythological creature. The coelacanth was a creature that was considered to be extinct until I think about 1949, 1950, where they actually caught one off of I don't really remember where in Africa. It was off the coast in Africa. Now several more have been caught, but so there's lots of animals that either are believed to have been are believed to be extinct, and people are still seeing them, or really there's no record or anything like them in the animal kingdom right now. But people are still claiming to see it.
Loch Ness Monster,
Yep.
and that's with the drawing behind you for anybody who will only hear the audio, that's what that looks like. It looks like a
Yeah.
very cute
Yeah, it's
drawing of
adorable. It's a and there's a
the Loch Ness
buoy
Monster.
behind it, you know. It was I would say it's a very standard cartoon sea monster, that
Yes,
he's drawn.
and I think that's, maybe that's a good way to start talking about the paranormal because I think that's what a lot of people think about when they hear the term paranormal, but we could just as well say, I mean, there are parts of the paranormal that we would just talk about as spiritual, a spiritual
Mhm.
experience, experiencing a deceased loved one after, the spirit of someone you've loved after they've passed away. And that's actually one of the most common types of experiences. So
Or
there's a huge range.
yeah, or having following your gut instinct. Something that just
Absolutely.
kind of, like some sense of impending, you know, problem or trauma that you pay attention to that saves your life, that's ESP. Or just eh, guessing right every time a coin is flipped. All of that would fall into the paranormal, and in fact I would say the coin actually falls into probably the most uh convincing evidence of paranormal, that paranormal research or paranormal studies have come up with. I mean, the Rhine Institute and whatnot actually did coin flips to see if there was if there was statistical, y- if they could prove it through statistics that people have those types of experiences.
Yeah, I mean, it's paranormal is such a hugely broad umbrella, but it has a connotation of something being bizarre or, for some people sinister, and it doesn't necessarily have to be either of those. Like you said, gut feelings.
Right.
Um, I'm just trying to think. There was something energy healing.
Hmm.
I would argue that, and some people will disagree, but we just did an episode a few ones back on energy healing and the
Hmm.
science showing that there is an effect. And
Right.
but that also because it's outside of the mainstream and it's talking about something that is outside of our normal sensory ability or perception, so we as far as we know.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think that a lot of times paranormal, yeah, it does have a spooky connotation to it. I think it also has a anti-intellectual kind of, or a non-intellectual
yeah.
uh feeling about it, or that like I'm looking at the pictures, and for those of you who aren't seeing this, I have a smorgasbord of weird pictures behind me, including the Jersey Devil and some spirit photography, and a lot of this is actually research into some of the other things that we're going to be covering. But there's also uh this idea that if you study or are involved in the paranormal in some way, or not involved in the paranormal, but if you're involved in the paranormal from a from a belief perspective or a studying perspective, that in some way you're not as necessarily as educated or as intelligent or whatnot. And I think that that's kind of like really bad PR. I think that there are
And
lots of
disinformation.
it's and it is. I mean, because there are lots of subjects that fall comfortably into the paranormal sphere, but also fall comfortably into the medical and into the psychological and into the environmental, and they're still paranormal, and things are paranormal until they're explained. I would argue that the word paranormal is akin to the word art, in that it is a large umbrella that it covers a lot, and there's a subjectivity to it, so that some people will be like, nope, it's all about ghosts. Some people will be like, nope, it's all about UFOs. And some people will be like, no, it's all about energy and different things like that. I would argue it's all of those things.
Yeah,
I would argue that
and
it's
more.
everything. Yeah. Hmm.
And I wanna just point out again, you're somebody with a graduate degree in history, you are a historian, you really take a more in-depth and serious approach to these things, and in fact, just for people who don't know what we did this past weekend, Kathy and I, as people normally do, of course,
Oh,
went
studies on your
to
Saturdays.
a historic graveyard in, Morristown, New Jersey, for anybody
Mhm.
who wants to check it out. A lot of Revolutionary War and other gravestones there, and, Kathy had this incredible background not only on this very unfortunate historical event, it was a crime, a kind of brutal one, but reported haunting there, but Kathy, you also have more knowledge of headstones and the
Yeah.
art on headstones and the different periods in history that, where certain things were significant on them. I'm not articulating that well, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But more than anybody I know. And you're
Yeah.
just kinda like off the top of your head, like, "Oh, well, blah, blah."
Well, I mean, I think we lean into the things that interest us, and history is obviously a passion of mine. I went back and got my master's degree. I was a paranormalist long before I got my master's degree in history, but I would argue that I was a historian long before that too. I think that, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form minimizing the importance of getting education and certainly pursuing advanced degrees if that's what you choose to do. Um, I love learning that way, so it was great for me. I really, really enjoyed it. Um, but I also, uh, I could discuss paranormal subjects very easily with a great depth of knowledge, but I wasn't taken seriously. And I that didn't bother me as much as it bothered me when I watched other people who weren't as comfortable articulating their feelings or weren't as comfortable articulating their interests kind of get bullied because of their interests, and I thought, well, yeah, I'm going to go. I'll get this degree. Um and it'll allow me to kind of sit at the table and bring other people to the table with me. But I mean, I have always said that for me, the paranormal has always been a gateway into history for me, and I think it's a way of I think it's a way of experiencing history, both literally and just kind of, figuratively. But I mean, if you're talking about spirit activity or anything like that, and you're talking about beings that existed in a different historical time, you're literally experiencing that history. But I can't think of a better way to spend a Saturday afternoon than wandering through and in a really well protected kind of isolated for being in the middle of a bustling little downtown.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost completely hidden, and it is one of those crossroads of the American Revolution kind of graveyards where there's amazing artwork, and when you think of it in someone's lifetime, probably in the 18th century, late 18th century, they wouldn't be buying sculptures, they wouldn't be buying artwork. So one of the biggest expenses that they would have would be the monument to them after they've passed. And so when you look at those, and the ones that we saw were really stunning and really wonderful works of art.
Yeah, absolutely.
These stories are more than just casual kind of things. They become integral parts of communities, and to me, that's a big part of the paranormal is the stories that continue to get told over and over.
Yeah, absolutely. And I what I wanted to do is just, I've spoken probably very briefly on this podcast on Unpacking Possibility about my own kind of transpersonal experiences, intuitive experiences and so forth. Not in the same way or to the same degree as on Curious Explorers, but you and I got involved in wanting to do this podcast. We met shortly after you opened the Paranormal Museum and bookstore, or the bookstore first and then the museum in Asbury Park. We hit it off. We both had, I think, just a natural curiosity about things, albeit from different perspectives and professional perspectives. But, you know, I think we've talked to people and we've heard from people who've subscribed to Curious Explorers about how, um, not only how common it is to have these kind of experiences are outside the realm of every day for most
Mm.
people, right? But also, just the fact that we're 2 women and I'm gonna say 2 mature women,
Women of a
and that
certain age.
we're in the best possible way,
Yeah.
and that's something that you don't see people in this kind of demographic talking about these issues largely, in a way that's accessible to your average person who's like, "Oh my god, I had something like that happen too," or "I've always been curious about this," or "I've always been worried about this and now I don't feel as worried about it,"
Mhm.
or and so because I think most of what we see on TV, would you agree, is mostly men, talking about the paranormal and a few young
Yeah,
women?
I think so. I mean, and I will say I don't think that bears out as far as who actually does the kind of investigative stuff. And it certainly doesn't bear out as far as who attends events and things like that. I would say that there are definitely more women that I've come in contact with who are, actively involved in the paranormal, and I wouldn't say it's, like, overwhelmingly, but I definitely don't think it's 50-50. I would say it's probably more like 60-40, which is not to say that the interest or the belief or the curiosity about isn't 50-50. Just the people who are actually taking the next step to actually do things. Um, so I don't think what you see on television bears out as far as what you see on the day to day. I'll say I think when it comes to people who just kind of come up to me and talk about what their interests are, it's it's every age, it's every, it's men, it's women, it's kids, I think, the television shows have mainstreamed this stuff quite a bit so that you find, that families have an actual interest together. So it's something that families do together, and that's something that I've noticed trending for the last, 15 or 16 years. I've noticed that it's trended in a way that I think is really great because it's families going out and exploring things together. Generally speaking, they do start with ghosts. They definitely do start with ghosts, but they go into other subjects a lot too. And I think that that's really terrific.
I'm just thinking too, like, and again, this is just personal observation, it's not data, but we will talk about data in a moment. When I think about, again, if I look at who's, in a starring role on many of these TV shows, it does look different than, I have friends who are mediums. I've gone and done mediumship training, many of them. A lot of times it is more women.
Hmm.
I think a lot of times at the seances you've held at the museum, a lot of women.
Oh yeah, yeah, a lot of
Um,
women. Hmm.
Ghost tours, probably a good mix. So
Yeah, I would say ghost tours are, you know, right down the line. Seances are gonna be Seances, I would say, are mostly women, not overwhelmingly women, but also I think that has to do with who I am. You know what I mean? Um, that being said, most of the I would say psychics that I've worked with have been 50-50. You know, right? In fact, I think I've worked with more men as far as who comes in and works for mediumship or psychic phenomena. But the people who come to visit them are the mostly women. There's a lot of women. And I think mainly that I think it's because it is something women do collectively together. They'll go for a reading
That's
or,
totally
it's
true,
it's kind of an entertainment thing.
but a connection thing as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. It is. And but I will say there are definitely men that got and it has changed. You know, I it has I've seen it change. When I first opened Paranormal in 2008, I changed the name of the business to Paranormal from House of Spirits, and the reason was I didn't think men would come to something called House of Spirits, and I thought, well, paranormal will appeal to anyone who's interested in the paranormal. I think it was the best thing I ever did because it it changed my business from an occult business to a curiosity business. So it was less about the belief in something and more about the interest in something. So it was less about, oh, let me, this is a place where you can be told something to, hey, this is a place where you can ask questions and maybe we can find answers together. Paranormal almost had like a scientific-y or a science-y kind of name to it. And I definitely think that I think that the concept of paranormal has changed over the last 15 or 16 years. But yeah, and when I look at what's going on television, or I should say in media, because I don't think a lot of people, I don't, there's people who consume their media, and it's not on a TV show. It's going to be on a podcast, or it's going to be, on a TikTok or a live or something like that. There does seem to be a formula, and I don't think that the formula necessarily bears out what people are really doing. You do tend to see, like, 2 guys and a girl or, you know, and I'm sure that that has to do with different metrics for advertising and whatnot, like, but because it doesn't bear out as far as I'm concerned of who's actually doing investigations and who's actually, showing up even for lectures, like I do a bunch of free lectures every year, and um, you know, I it's definitely not 2 to 1. It's definitely more like 50 or 60% female to 40 or 50% male.
As you're bringing that up, I just wanna give a shout out to the upcoming Jersey Devil Fable Film Festival.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Yes. So I run the Jersey Devil Fable Festival.
Oh, sorry. Fable
Well, we
Fest
have the film festival as
Yes, the
well.
film festival, yes.
We do have we have something called the Pod Barons, which there'll be podcasters there. Um, you know, I it's an exploration of folklore mythology, which I think is kind of the beginnings of the paranormal. So I think people they hide their paranormal behind those words. Um, but I don't know. I like looking at it from all different aspects, and there's some stuff that's come up, especially like this year. A lot of people are talking about all of the UFOs that have been seen in New Jersey, which we
Sure.
saw for 3 or 4 weeks and then suddenly disappeared. Um, I don't know. I'd like to talk about it. I'd like to have a place where people can come and chat about uh, strange, unusual things that may or may not be alien in nature, but certainly were worthy of discussing, um, even after they just suddenly disappeared.
Yeah.
They just kind of went away.
Yeah, I don't have any idea what's going on with that. I don't even wanna speculate. I guess we'll see what happens. I but yeah, you have great events, heavily attended by all genders,
Yeah.
absolutely super interesting, they're fun, they're lighthearted, they're educational, just a great time. So if anybody's thinking about that, in the show notes, I'll make sure to put Kathy's website, and you can find out more about that and the the tours and the museum and so forth. Kath, I wanted to go over just a few statistics from various surveys about the paranormal. I'm sure you are already familiar, but also for the listeners and as kind of just a way of explaining, like, okay, who really believes in what? What does this mean? What are we talking about again when we're talking about the paranormal? Okay. Basically, in this U.gov survey of 1,000 people, a pretty representative sample of people in the United States, adults, it was online. And they asked, there were two related surveys. And in the first one, they asked people about, in an open ended kind of fashion, what kinds of paranormal experiences they had had. And the answers fell into broadly 13 categories of paranormal experience. And so they did a follow-up survey and found that uh, I'm going to say 67% of people had had at least one type of paranormal encounter. Some people had had more than one. Out of people who had had paranormal encounters, a quarter thought they had lived in a house that was haunted. Uh, About 29% reported having more than 5 encounters with a spirit or a ghost. 35% believe there was a supernatural explanation for the paranormal types of phenomena they had experienced. 30% thought spirits that they had encountered were actually good versus evil. And again, this is not my wording, this is the wording of the survey. And then another 27% of those people who had experienced some sort of otherworldly encounter said that they had encountered a mix of good spirits and bad spirits. Again, by their definition. But it was interesting because, over a third, 37% of Americans in this sample said that they had felt the presence of an unknown energy or an unknown being. And I'm going to give you some examples because when I say it, just like an unknown energy, a lot of people are saying, well, I can't relate to that. But what I'm going to say next, I think a lot of people could relate to. I think this is one of the most common types of experiences people have. So somebody was quoted as saying, I woke up immediately after my grandfather passed away and felt something was in the room with me. I saw what looked like heat waves hanging in the air beside the bed. And I think this person attributed this to the presence of their grandparent. Um, that's one example. Certainly, other people have had experiences. Most common, again, having the experience of seeing or hearing or feeling or having some other felt experience of a loved one who's passed away. Not uncommon at all across cultures, not even just in this survey. Other people have had experiences of smelling something that wasn't there. This is in 2022, it would have been during COVID. I'm saying that because I know people have had olfactory kind of hallucinations since having COVID, but not everybody. This is also a commonly reported phenomenon, smelling cigarette smoke when someone who passed away was a heavy smoker. Or I knew a psychic many years ago, and after her friend had passed away, she would smell coffee brewing. And this person was somebody who would drink coffee all day long, that kind of thing. Um, Hearing the voice of a deceased loved one. Here's one that I think is harder to demonstrate as a paranormal experience, but a lot of people have had um, experiencing a change in temperature where there's no objective reason you can find where the temperature would drop suddenly. Electronic phenomena, seeing lights or other devices turn on or off without explanation, and there's no electrical problem. This is less common. 22% of the sample say they've seen an object move without explanation. But again, more common than most people might think. Doors opening and closing, that's 20%. And according to another survey, 42% of people believe in UFOs or unidentified flying objects. Now it's also called UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. And then in this real clear poll, and then I'll stop here and uh, again, we'll chat about it, but over 70% of people in a 1,000-person sample reported believing in the devil, like the incarnation of evil, I guess. I don't know how else we would describe that. And in that same sample, 84% reported believing in God. So there's a lot more we could talk about with this, but the point of naming all of these statistics and giving examples is that there's a huge range, again, even beyond what we were talking about, of things that fall under the paranormal umbrella, but they're actually pretty common. Mother's intuition was not in the survey, but I think that's extraordinarily common.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, a couple of things. One, what depending on the words that people used when they were doing these polls, right? So if you do something, you're like, oh, it's a paranormal experience, you might get people who are more resistant to that than just saying, hey, have you ever followed your instinct? Have you ever known who was going to answer, who was going to be on the phone before you picked it up? Have you ever not gotten on a plane, or something along those lines, where if you're not prefacing it with the idea that the phenomena that they're experiencing is paranormal in nature, you might get a different. And I don't know the poll, so I don't know.
Absolutely.
But what I do think is interesting is number is n- how personal the experiences that people have. It's it's something. It's my grandfather. It is. I had this sense. It was something that was related to me, and and that why it's so difficult to quantify paranormal experiences is because they're subjective and they're
Yeah.
personal, and they're not something that exists. It's not gravity. It's like art. It's going to be very subjective, it's going to be very personal, and because um you know I've had a few experiences in my life that when I verbalize them to try and explain them, they don't sound as profound or as convincing as they were to me. You know, like if you've ever tried to describe a dream, and you start talking about this dream, and you're like, oh, and you were there, but then you were a unicorn, and then you were, and then you were a coal miner, and in the dream it makes sense to you. And even
Yeah.
in the telling of the dream, it makes sense because it's not a literal representation of something. It's the fluidity of the message of the dream. And you as the receiver gets it, right? Because there is a unique language that is just between you and the dream. And I think in a lots of cases, when you're having a paranormal experience, or when let's not even just say a paranormal experience, when you're specifically having what I would describe as a spiritual and energetic experience, meaning that you're communicating in some way with a non corporeal being, okay? And especially if it's someone that you think that that language that you have is not a literal language. It's a nuanced language of images, sights, sounds, and feelings, right? So I lean into those experiences. I would say that the most commonly reported paranormal experience that people talk to me about is a sense of presence. And I don't throw away a sense of presence because, as a human being on planet Earth in 2025, I pay attention to when I feel someone is around me. I pay attention to that for my security. I pay attention to that for their security. I pay attention to that because it's part and parcel of living in this world. And so when someone else says that, especially when they're like, I knew there was somebody at the door and I opened the door and there was nobody there. Um, it's so easy to throw that away. But if you were sitting in that room with them and they were like, I think there's someone behind that door, you would probably trust them. And so I find that it's interesting the things that people report in that poll, because to me that's a very narrow part of paranormal study. It's an interesting one, and it's probably the one that we're mostly interested in, which is the things that directly impact us. I think it's interesting that, you have people who believe in God, and maybe they don't believe in the devil, or vice versa, or I think it's really interesting that, I've met good ghosts and I've met evil ghosts. What about just regular, what about just some guy walking down the street? Which Because I think the paranormal is probably less, um, less miraculous, or less, I think it's more mundane than we, give it credit for being, because if it does exist, then it kind of exists, right? And it's just right there with us. Um, I do think that when people have those experiences, they when they have a large enough experience that it shifts their interest from interest to belief, or interest to, like, wow, I really have something, this really changed how I see things. They look at it as being profound and being, miraculous or something like that. And so it's very easy then to go into, well, I was uncomfortable when that happened, therefore that is an evil spirit, when it could just be like, no, that was just Charlie, and he didn't even know you were there, which is probably more common than an evil spirit. Although not if you listen to our podcast,
Yeah.
if you listen to our podcast, there's a
I
lot of evils.
yes. Let's give people a heads up, because
Yeah.
if they go check that out, there are things that are, we talk about precognitive dreams. That's one of our earlier episodes, and orbs, which I think are pretty neutral. We did an episode, as I said, about energy healing, but we also do go into a kind of a darker realm, and so you don't have to listen to those episodes if that doesn't feel like a fit for you, although we know there is an audience for that. And we find that stuff interesting and intriguing.
And don't only listen to that. No, you can. You can only
Yeah.
listen to that.
It's really up to you.
It's really up to you. Well, but I do think that there's kind of, it's like
If you
people
see a
like.
scary movie,
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
like
it's
people like
kinda not that different.
extremes. Well
Yeah.
well, also, it's the extreme. It's like the difference between a butter knife and a steak knife. You know what I mean? So the butter knife is the orbs, but the steak knife has a sharper
Y
point. And I
That's
think
great,
that
Kathy. I'm
I
gonna steal
think
that.
that I think that that I also think that there is something about, the more, extreme cases, and they're not just the more extreme cases of, like, hauntings, but the negative, and how they impact the people who are experiencing them, because, it's happening to them, it's safely happening to them, it's not happening to me. Yes, it's safe for me to be afraid of that and everything like that, but also, if I am having these other experiences, maybe the footsteps that I hear at grandma's house, or maybe the sense of grandpa sitting at the bed, maybe, that's not as big a deal as, these demonic, cases, or these much, much more robust kind of, and when we talk about, like, big cases, we're talking about where people's lives are literally being overtaken by the experiences that they're having. Um, and, that's, you know, you I think you said something like, I mean, that's an astonishing number to me, that 25% of people, uh claim to have experienced a spirit. That's 250 people out of that 1,000 people claim to have experienced a spirit. So,
To me, that seems low, and I can go back to the survey.
the reason why it doesn't seem low to me is because experiencing a spirit and experiencing something unusual are two different things,
100%.
right?
Totally agree.
Um, I, I, and I would imagine the anonymity of the poll allowed people to kind of, but I also
Okay.
would say that the last 15 years of this stuff being on television, Like I said, it's given people a language, a vocabulary, and it's mainstream these feelings. A lot. I get I hear a lot of stories about footsteps. I hear a lot of stories about doors closing. I hear a lot of sense of presence, and people immediately then assume that they're dealing with, you know, they use ghost and spirit interchangeably, and so I will in this case as well. That they're dealing with a ghost.
Well, I want to address that actually quickly because it's going to tie into an example that I've never forgotten. And I think I might have talked about this on Curious Explorers. I can't remember if it was there or here. Be more likely there. But it- ghost to me is, and I've had this happen, by the way. You go stay at a historic inn and somebody is standing by the bed in the middle of the night. I would say ghosts because they're not connected to me, and they might have been hanging around that inn for a few hundred years. But is that a technical term for me? No. But there's a category that things fit into when I say ghost.
Hmm.
Now, as I'm pretty sure I talked about this on Curious Explorers a while back, but when I was a trainee, I elected to do a year in pediatric oncology, which, again, one of the most profound years of my life in a very meaningful way. I worked with a lot of families. If the children were very young, especially pre-verbal, really it's working with the families, usually the mothers. So I saw people outpatient. I also saw people inpatient. And what that means at a major hospital is that people are coming from all over the world, and sometimes their children are living for, it might be a year
Right.
on an inpatient oncology unit. And, many children did well or well enough and were able to go home, but there's a subset that don't and they pass in the hospital. And of course, it is one of the worst things that can happen to a person to lose their child. But, over the course of that year, one of the mothers who was, probably maybe early 30s, her child had been maybe about a year
Hmm.
when he came on the unit and, went through treatment. So, I definitely saw her most days a week. Um, but I didn't know her as well as some of the other mothers because, it's not, we didn't do formal therapy together. But I remember being in a room like, for family members to just kind of hang out and be with each other. And I was talking to one of the other mothers, and I think there was only one other person there. And this woman came in the room, maybe I'm going to say a week or two after her son had passed. She was probably getting ready to go back to her home country. Um, and she saw me and she said, "Can I talk to you?" And I said, "Of course." And she said, "I want to tell you something, but you're going to think I'm crazy." And I said, "Whatever you're going to tell me, I absolutely will not think that." And I meant it. And basically, she, of course, had been devastated to have gone through all of this and then have her son pass, at a toddler. But what she said is she had been in I think she was staying at like the Ronald McDonald House for the year. And she was in her room, and by the door, all of a sudden she saw her little boy, but it wasn't like a fleeting image. And I don't remember if she just said she knew what he said, like that it was more telepathic. And in the moment, I don't even think or if she heard him say, but that he was fine. And she said he looked beautiful and he looked healthy. And she felt such a sense of peace. And then, that was it. And then he was not there, but it was more than like a split second corner of the eye, sighting. To me, that's a spirit. You and I would probably agree that the spirit of her son. And there are people who would say, well, a grieving brain. The position I take personally is, first of all, I think he probably, of course, wanted his mother to know he was okay. And I believe that's possible. So it's not a hard sell for me. But even if her mind created the experience she had needed, it was profoundly healing and transformative and necessary. And I think when we talk about, I almost hesitate to put that under the umbrella of paranormal for people who don't know how broad that umbrella is. But these experiences can be profoundly spiritual and uplifting and healing, and that is part of this very broad category.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and the other thing is we talked about on Curious Explorers recently is, angelic experiences.
Mhm.
People report those. I have had, I think, 2 in my life, and you know, but like you said, it is very hard to articulate what the experience is like
Right.
the way another person can get where you're coming from.
Right. Right. Because I mean, it's our language is linear, right? So the way we communicate with each other is linear, and we follow a routine of articulation and language and whatnot. But the way we communicate is not, right? So we're taking in lots of different things and we're putting out lots of different things. And so it's not just this like, this line of dialogue or this line of narrative that and yet and yet people want it to be when it comes to accepting or honoring or respecting or believing an experience that someone else has had that deviates from like for instance if there's an onus on someone who has had what we would call a paranormal experience that I don't feel anymore. I don't care if people believe me. I don't care. But if you said to somebody, hey, you know what? Don't go swimming right over there because there are sharks, right? And well, how do you know there are sharks? Well, there was some guy out there before and you know, he saw a shark, right? Oh, okay. Then I'm not gonna go swimming in there. Don't go in that house. Why? Because there are ghosts. Why? What are you talking about? Well, somebody was in there and they saw that there were ghosts. So there's these different levels. Now, yes, sharks exist and we've seen them and they're part of they're empirically proven to exist and whatnot. But but if someone said, "No, I was in there and I felt bad and or something felt off to me or something felt dangerous or something felt, to me," we don't trust that. We don't trust that because we can't fully convey what we actually experienced because it wasn't only sight or sound or I'm thinking of one particular thing. When my father passed away, my father died, 20 20 almost 28 years ago. And I remember the night after he died, I remember I had a dream and in this I call it a dream, right? At the time it didn't feel like a dream. But there was this figure, I was laying in bed and there was this figure that was kind of like floating next to me. It didn't look like him. It didn't look like him, but I knew it was him. And it was almost like something was there in his proximity, right? Now, if I were to explain to you what he looked like or what he said or anything like that, I would sound like a lunatic, I mean, I'm probably halfway sound that way
You don't
now.
sound that way to
But
me.
but but I mean, I know what I experienced. I know what it meant to me. I know how I felt at that moment. I can't I can't explain it to you because I can't make you feel that way. It's like trying to make someone feel the love you feel for someone else or trying to make someone feel the distrust that you feel for somebody else or those are they're just things that you can describe but you can't make someone feel that way. And I think that when you're talking about paranormal experiences, until you have one, and then I think sometimes after you have one, that's why a lot of people, when you start talking about I always make the joke that when I tell people what I do, um, I get, I get two very different statements, and then exactly the same statement after that, right? So people either say, um, "Oh, I totally believe that." I totally believe one time, and then they go on and tell me the one time they had an experience, or they say, "I don't believe any of that crap, but one time," and then they go to tell me. So I do think that, when you talk about paranormal experiences, in an effort to show that you understand it, people pull out experiences that they've had, even though those experiences are going to be different from yours. It's kind of like a way of illustrating, something unusual happened to me as well, and I understand your sense of um, either belief or wonder or doubt, or something along those lines. I think that the use of the word spiritual is often difficult, because you can mean spiritual in a kind of um, self-realizing, fulfillment, and like emotional kind of thing that people feel. And then you can literally mean, no, I just mean a spirit. I mean that there's a and so I think it's really important when people are talking about that, for them to define their terms um pretty much each time. And I do think that there is a distinction between, to me I use them interchangeably, but I do clarify it when I'm saying it. But like, I would say ghost a ghost to me might be residual in nature, and not have an intellect, or not have intelligence, and just be a kind of visual or auditory uh repetitive phenomena. And then a spirit would be something that has personality, and the ability to communicate, and maybe not the awareness of the ability, but certainly the ability. But I do think we all have kind of our own, we all kind of have our yardstick for uh for what's what.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Kathy, I mean, you and I could talk about this for days, and
And
we
have.
have.
And have.
But I wanna be mindful of your time and our listeners' time, but, I guess all of this is just to say that, there's so much more in this paranormal umbrella than most people realize. More people listening have, I'm sure, had experiences like we're talking about, or at least, you certainly know people who have if you haven't yourself, and I think you probably have. Um, and and again, if in an even wider circle would have some sort of curiosity about this, I'm sure. So if you are curious, dear Unpacking Possibility listeners, please consider heading over to YouTube at Curious Explorers Show, and I'll put it in the show notes, or finding us on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, wherever you find your podcasts. Check out the show. You can skip the scarier episodes if they're
Jump
not
right
for you,
into
or
them.
jump right into them like we do. But Kath, any final thoughts or anything that we should cover that we didn't, or
No, but I do think this fits under, I think there's a lot of things that fit under this umbrella. And I would just say to people who are listening, who are kind of, um maybe deciding whether to put a toe in that, this is all just part of the broader human experience. And with regard to looking at the paranormal, you know, as we learn more about it, the boundaries get pushed further back. So, I would say, just be like everything else, right? Just kind of be open to it, and weigh your evidence, and make your own determinations. But we do have a lot of great conversations, so it would be great to have you guys there.
yeah, we absolutely do, and we would love to have you check it out. Kathy, thanks again for coming on this show, and I look
Happy.
forward to connecting on Curious Explorers with you, of course, again. And you can check out Kathy's other, I don't want to say regular podcast, 'cause now Curious Explorers is as well. But is there a link to that on your website, or?
There is. You can hit podcasts, and you can actually get to both Curious Explorers and the Paranormal Museum with Kathy Kelly.
Awesome. So, Kath, thanks again. This has been another episode of Unpacking Possibility. If you like the episode, and I know you did, Please remember to like, share, follow, leave me a comment, send me a message. Let me know what you'd like to hear more of. And as always, until next time, be well. I know that the paranormal is real. Listen. You've just listened to the Curious Explorers podcast with the Kathy Kelly and Traci Stein. If you enjoyed the episode, remember to like, share, follow, leave us a comment, let us know what you think. And of course, until next time, stay curious.
The paranormal is real. It is real. The paranormal is real. Is it? The paranormal is real. It is real. The paranormal is real.